Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out to GitHub Universe today. I hope you're really excited to be here. I know I am. My name is Edward Thomson. And as excited as I hope we all are to be here, I hope you'll indulge me for just 1 minute. If you could close your eyes and pretend for just a second that you're not actually at GitHub Universe. And when you open them, I'd like you to pretend instead that the year is 1976. And if you weren't around in 1976, I know most of you probably weren't actually alive yet. One of the things we didn't have in the mid-1970s was these brilliant, high-color graphics displays. You had two options, amber on black or green on black. And they actually weren't these lovely high-resolution displays either. We didn't have these great, retina displays with all these pixels in them. If you wanted artwork on your screen in the mid-1970s, you were building ASCII art. And you were doing it really slowly because the bandwidth between our computers and our displays was awfully limited. There were a lot of other differences, of course, in the 1970s. I think a lot of you will recognize this man. It's Bill Gates, billionaire, Bill Gates, philanthropist. But in the 70s, he was neither of those things. He also wasn't yet Bill Gates, millionaire, playboy, posing on top of computers. He wasn't even Bill Gates, juvenile delinquent. He was just Bill Gates, the startup founder, building a little company with his buddy Paul Allen. So in the mid-1970s, Bill Gates went to the high-tech mecca of Albuquerque, New Mexico, because there was a little company there called Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. And MITS was building a new type of computer. Before, if you wanted a computer, you could get a mainframe that would fill the room. Or you could get a mini computer that was the size of a refrigerator. It's not really that many after all. But MITS was enabling people to build their own computers. They would advertise in the back of a magazine like Popular Electronics or a radio magazine. And they would encourage people who were already hobbyists with electronics to build a computer. So you could fill out this form in the back of the magazine and send it in, and MITS would send you a box full of parts that you had to assemble yourself. And once you did this, once you tediously assembled this computer, you had a thing with some switches and some lights on it. And it didn't really do all that much. And that's where Bill Gates and Paul Allen came in. So in the 1970s, Microsoft was building interpreters for these hobbyist microcomputers, basic interpreters, and selling them, like right there in the back pages of the magazines, right next to the ads for the Altair. But the people who were building these computers tended to work together. They tended to talk to each other. They congregated in communities. And they were working together to help each other assemble these computers and to get the most out of them. And they were sharing their knowledge. And another thing that they shared was the software. They would actually share Microsoft's basic interpreters with each other. Now, if you've ever seen Bill Gates' temper, you can imagine that he wasn't real happy about people taking his software and sharing it without paying him. And so in 1976, he wrote a letter to these hobbyists. He put it right there in the back of Popular Electronics, right next to the Altair ads and next to his actual ad for his interpreters. And he said that they were stealing his software. They weren't sharing. Notice the subtle language difference. They were stealing his software. And he concluded with his address and invited anybody who was reading this and had stolen his software to write him a check, to pay up. So from the very inception of Microsoft, we weren't really all that happy with people sharing software. And that didn't change for many, many years. In the mid-90s, the workstations, the technical workstations were sort of becoming dethroned. The Intel computers were becoming so powerful that suddenly you didn't necessarily need a Sun workstation or an IBM or an HP to do your computing. You could get a very powerful Intel machine and you could run T on it. Or you could run Linux on it. And at the time, Linux was actually becoming very popular because it was a Unix-like workstation, much like the Suns, that were more expensive and not really all that much more powerful. And so Bill Gates went off on these Linux workstations. They used a license called the GNU Public License, which Bill Gates said that Microsoft disagrees with. He said that he dislikes open source software because, quote unquote, nobody can improve it ever. I think he kind of missed the point there, but it kind of shows the tension that he had with free and open source software. The CEO after Bill, a guy named Steve Ballmer, wasn't much better. He actually said, Linux is a cancer. Oof. So it's interesting that Microsoft was founded on these principles, and yet today, our current CEO, Satya Nadella, will stand up in front of a big sign that says that Microsoft loves Linux. That's incredible. And last year's Octoverse, the GitHub report card, listed Microsoft as one of the organizations with the most open source contributors. So how did we get here? So I work on part of the team at Microsoft working on Visual Studio Team Services. And I can only tell you my little part of that story. A lot of teams within Microsoft were actually working on open source kind of independently. So I don't want to take all of the credit by any stretch of the imagination. I can only tell you what I know. So in 2009, that's actually when I started at Microsoft. I worked for a little company called Team Prize. If you've never heard of us, that's fine. We had 4 engineers. And we worked, our headquarters was in a cornfield in central Illinois. We worked on enterprise version control systems, and we had cross-platform clients for that. Microsoft had its own version control systems, but they didn't have cross-platform. So they acquired us to kind of fill that gap. And if you've ever worked on a team of 4 people, you can imagine we didn't write all the code ourselves. We got as much open source into our product as we could because, for the love of God, nobody should be rewriting a Java logging framework in the year 2009. So when Microsoft acquired us, they looked at our code base, and they were a little bit surprised to see how much open source we had. And the lawyers were really unhappy with the amount of code that was licensed under the GNU public license, that license that Bill Gates doesn't believe in. So we actually had 3 products when Microsoft decided to acquire us. We had to, quote unquote, remediate all the open source code in 2 of those products. We had to either rewrite it, or some of the licenses, of course, were acceptable to Microsoft. So that was no problem. The 3rd product of ours had so much open source software in it, because it was we used an open source UI library framework. And we were totally dependent on that. But the license was a little unpalatable to Microsoft at the time. It was so bad that we actually had to stop shipping that product. When we were acquired, we had 3. The next day, Microsoft was selling 2. It's never seen the light of day again. It was incredible to us. Despite that, our acquisition was what Microsoft considers a big success. So we were able to add the cross-platform version control clients to what was then Microsoft Team Foundation Server. And so in 2009, the industry analyst Gartner, I won't bore you with all the details, puts out a Magic Quadrant report and Suffice it to say that being over on the right-hand side of this graph is good, and being up at the top is good, and Microsoft was at the top and the farthest right. So we thought we were doing great. The problem with surveys, though, is that they can be a little bit misleading. Sometimes people say they like something, but in fact, it's not very good. If you guys don't remember New Coke, let me give you a more contemporary example. I think you can just look at the politicians in basically all of the countries right now. And just because they won something on a survey doesn't mean that they're actually any good. Team Foundation Server was a little bit that way. Let me just real quick give you a little background. When Team Foundation Server came out, it had its own version control system, a centralized version control system called TFVC. And it was a checkout, edit, check-in system. I won't go like into super deep version control theory on you, don't worry. But the idea is that files are locked until you actually communicate with the server and make them writable. You have to check them out explicitly from the server. And the reason for that is so that they can scale to insanely large code bases. We built this to handle the Windows code base, the Office code base, things like that. Multi-100 gigabyte code bases. So you want something that has this sort of characteristics. But if you're not working on Windows, if you have a more modest size application, maybe you only have 100 megabytes of code or even just 5, this really gets in your way. You have to communicate with the server all the time. So our customers weren't really thrilled with it. So in 2012, we came out with a different type of system. We added to TFVC, and we added what's called an edit, merge, commit system. The idea here is it looks to see on your disk what you've changed, and it'll just tell you right there. So in 2012, we had reinvented Subversion, basically. However, we were really proud of ourselves for doing this. Our customers still not so much. This is just a random sampling of things that our customers were saying about us at the time. Some of them had even taken to redefining our 3-letter acronym, TFS, as Team Frustration Server. This is a real bummer. This is why you should never use acronyms in your product name. But on my team, the cross-platform team, to be honest with you, we weren't much happier at the time because we were actually a distributed team. I was in Chicago. One of my coworkers was in Raleigh, North Carolina. My buddy Martin, another coworker, in Northern Ireland. And of course, our source control server, because it's Microsoft, was in Redmond. And so one day, I think it was Martin, his internet connection was down, and he said, guys, come on. Maybe we should be using a distributed version control system. And we laughed, because this seemed ridiculous to us because we were, of course, building a version control system. And at Microsoft, we eat our own dog food. It's what we do. We use the products that we build so that we make sure that we are successful using them. This idea caught hold for us. We decided, well, if we're going to eat our own dog food, maybe we should actually write our distributed version control system. And this was a challenging idea for us because distributed version control systems lack a lot of the functionality that centralized version control systems do that our customers had been telling us for years that they required, like auditing, compliance reports, very narrow-scoped security, and the ability to handle really large repositories like the Windows code base at 300 gigabytes. Distributed version control system at the time couldn't do any of those things. So we were really concerned about going down that road of distributed version control systems until we read a book. And if you've never read this, I totally recommend it. The Innovators Dilemma. The author sets up 2 types of technologies: sustaining innovations, and that's what Team Foundation version control was, our centralized version control system. It was doing everything that we thought our customers wanted. We were making incremental improvements to it, but it was, for the most part, very stable. Contrast that with a disruptive innovation, which doesn't seem to actually do anything that our customers wanted. It doesn't handle large repositories. It doesn't have fine-grained permissions control. It doesn't have, very distinct auditing. It has its own set of advantages. For distributed version control, it's usually lightweight branching, and the ability to have a much higher code velocity because of that. And so the author of this book argues that disruptive innovations will catch hold because of their advantages and ultimately displace the sustaining technologies. So we decided that we perhaps needed to at least take a gamble and put a distributed version control system into our product. So we decided to do that. We would, in fact, write a distributed version control system. So we went to our customers and we said, hey guys, have you heard the good news about distributed version control? And for the most part, they were like, I don't know what y'all are talking about. But a couple of them were on board. They were like, yeah, it's about time. We've been wanting VVCS for a long time. So we said, great, we're going to build a distributed version control system right into Team Foundation Server. And they kind of nodded. And they're like, what do you mean build? Like, oh, we've got some great ideas for how to support that. And then they kind of reminded us that maybe that wasn't such a good idea for us. What they wanted was Git. And what we were offering them was something else, some Microsoft DVCS. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I imagine it's something like that. And so they kind of looked at us like maybe we were a little bit crazy. And I'll never forget what they said to us. They said, maybe you guys are a little bit crazy. So at that point, we backed off and decided that maybe Git was the answer. We were seeing this tremendous upswell at GitHub. The open source technologies were absolutely getting behind Git. And we were even seeing Git used as in ways that I assume were never intended, like as a deployment pipeline. You could Git push your repository into Azure to deploy it. So it made no sense for us to do anything else. We decided that we had to put Git into Visual Studio, the IDE, into Team Foundation Server, our hosting platform, and into a new product called Visual Studio Team Services, which was Team Foundation Server hosted in Azure. This was our cloud-hosted code collaboration platform that we were really excited about. The problem with putting Git into all of these places is that they were all kind of established technologies. So we'd already built an architecture on Team Foundation Server around Microsoft SQL Server. And we were building our architecture for Visual Studio Team Services on top of Microsoft Azure. So Azure Blob Storage and SQL Azure. Now, if you want to host a Git repository, this isn't the way to do it. If you look at GitHub, if you look at their file servers, they're just Linux servers. And all of the Git repositories that you store are just, they look like the .git folder that you get when you clone the repository. It's really super straightforward. The optimal way to host a Git repository at the time was just to put it on disk. But our architecture was totally abstract and had all these, Azure-backed services that were really high performance for us, but would be really low performance to host a Git repository in. There was a solution for us, though, a project called libgit2. Instead of requiring everything to go to the file system, actually had this nice abstract pattern where we could plug in our own data providers. So we could actually store people's repositories in SQL Azure and Azure Blob Storage. So we started hacking on this. We spiked it. And we built out a prototype where you could host your Git repository in Azure using libgit2. You could push your repository, you could clone a repository, and we were really happy with the solution. So the next step for us was to go build pull requests. So we built this nice pull request workflow, and we realized that you couldn't actually close the pull request. You couldn't merge the pull request because libgit2 didn't have any code to do the merge. So that was a bit of a bummer for us. We realized that we were going to have to extend libgit2. We'd already embraced it. Now it was time to extend it. And that was no problem for us because we've been building version control technology for a long time. We could absolutely build merge code into libgit2. No problem. The problem was libgit2's license. It's under the GPL, that GPL that Bill Gates doesn't like so much. And that means that if we built this merge code, we would have to give it back to libgit2. We would have to open a pull request, send it back, and all the other users of libgit2 could use our merge code, users like GitHub. So we're building a code collaboration platform that fundamentally competes with GitHub. We're really going to hand them our intellectual property because we were really excited about our merge algorithm. We knew that we could do things in memory and with fewer resources than what running Git on the command line gives you. And so we knew if we gave this back to GitHub, they would be able to basically cut their server resources every time somebody clicks merge pull request. And Chris said, however mind-bogglingly many times that happens in a year, we were suddenly cutting the resources that GitHub needed to do that. And that's not theoretical. GitHub actually did adopt libgit2's merge engine to do pull requests. And it did actually save them a ton of resources. The blue sort of line at the top, the blue lines, are using Git, the command line Git, to merge pull requests. The green at the bottom is using libgit2. So it's much smoother and much more predictable, and it's a lot lower resources. And that's money, right? That adds up to CPU time and the cooling in the data center. Like, that's actual tangible money that Microsoft helped save GitHub, our competitors. So we were really worried about going down this path of contributing the merge code back to libgit2. But we realized, again, this was early in our understanding of open source at Microsoft, we realized that libgit2 isn't really our competitive advantage. Nobody chooses a code collaboration platform because they can merge a pull request just a little bit faster, right? You're never even going to notice. So this was an interesting discovery for us. We learned that open source really isn't a zero-sum game. So that was kind of the challenge for the product team to understand, that we could actually build open source software, collaborate in open source communities, and ultimately give back and actually work and collaborate with our competitors. And that's when my product team realized that we could do this and be successful with it. The problem was that we had to convince some other people that we could actually be successful with this, like our lawyers. The lawyers that made us kill off one of our products when we got acquired. We were really not excited about having a conversation with them. But we went to them and we told them that we wanted to use Git, and we wanted to use this GPL'd code. And I remember my lawyer looked at us and he digested all this and he said, well, I have some thoughts on this. But I'm really excited because right now I push all my code to GitHub. And when I'm hacking at night on my open source projects, I'd really love to be able to push to a Microsoft. And our minds were blown. It turns out our lawyer was a software engineer, like actually a better programmer than I am, and contributes to open source code when he goes home at night. So we got our lawyers on board. It turns out that the developer tools lawyers are actually a pretty cool bunch. This is actually our legal team. But there were other people that we had to convince, like our senior leadership. And at the time, it wasn't Satya Nadella yet. It was still Steve Ballmer. And this meeting I wasn't in. I wish I had been. But I understand that we went in and Steve said, I don't know about this. And we said, look, the developers want it. And Steve said, the developers?
Developers, 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 developers.
This is, of course, Steve.
Yes!
Steve at I think this was Microsoft's Professional Developers Conference. And there's a lot of things you can say about Steve Ballmer. He's a little excited and he's a lot sweaty. But he actually means this. Microsoft was built as a developer tools company. And so he said, OK, the developers want this. I'll make it happen. And so we put Git support into Visual Studio, the IDE, into Team Foundation Server, and into Visual Studio Team Services. And suddenly, people liked us again. Instead of people saying terrible things on the internet, they told us how awesome it was. And we were so happy. And so my buddy Martin, the one in Northern Ireland, who really helped make all of this happen, he decided he wasn't done yet. He decided that we'd had such success in working in open source communities and bringing open source into our product that maybe we should take it a step farther. And so Martin went to the .NET team and open sourced .NET Framework, the Roslyn compiler. He worked with them to open source a ton of Microsoft technologies and build out the .NET Foundation in order to responsibly manage that. And the cool thing about the .NET Foundation is that it wasn't just handling Microsoft's open source technologies, it was bringing in a bunch of other technologies from the community too. So there are all sorts of groundswell around doing open source in the .NET ecosystem. We're so excited by that. And that is how we ended up becoming an incredible open source contributor on GitHub. It wasn't just us, though. We were actually bringing people into the community to work on .NET open source projects. In 2015, we had a smattering of people working on it. By 2017, though, they were across the globe. And these aren't just little changes. People from outside Microsoft are making huge, impactful changes on the .NET platform. There's a guy named Ben Adams who, I think he's building a game. I don't actually remember what, but he's an independent developer, and he doesn't work for Microsoft at all. And he's decided to go through, basically step through line by line and profile the .NET framework as deeply as he can. And he's doing things like reducing the number of memory allocations. You know, I don't even know what all he's doing. The guy's crazy. He's an insanely good programmer. And he's making .NET better for everybody just because he wants his game to be faster. That's great. That's the open source ethos at work. And while we're doing this, we're so excited to see not just, again, Microsoft people, but we're bringing Google into the .NET Foundation. So again, we're learning how to work and collaborate with our competitors for the good of the entire ecosystem. So we're really proud of that. But that's not where it ends for us. We were really happy with the way we were bringing open source and contributing to open source. But what we needed to do was reflect a little bit. So I don't know how many of you have seen this, this illustration. It's a great comic. It points out the various org charts of various high-tech companies. And I wish I could dig into all of them. You should, check this out. But let's just zoom in on Microsoft. So this is a little bit unfair. But it's honestly, when I started at Microsoft, it's not a lot unfair. This isn't the way we would have described it. We would have used nicer euphemisms. We would have talked about how Microsoft lives in silos. And what we mean when we say that is that the Windows team is basically its own business unit. The Office team is basically its own business unit. Same with Visual Studio in the bad old days of Microsoft. Even though the Windows team absolutely uses Office every day, they use Word, they use Excel, and of course they use Outlook. That's basically the favorite program of any engineer or program manager at Microsoft. We live in email all the time. So the Windows team couldn't escape having to use Office. The Office team, of course, runs on Windows. And both of them build their code with Visual Studio and the compilers therein. And yet, there's not a lot of collaboration between these teams. In fact, at one point, the Windows team found a bug in the C++ compiler that the Visual Studio team owned. And legend has it that instead of bothering to report this bug and go get it fixed, that they just rolled back to a slightly older version that didn't have this bug anymore, checked it into the Windows source tree, and always compiled using that version. So not a lot of collaboration going on. When Satya Nadella came on board, he looked around and he realized that this was really a toxic atmosphere for us. We really were almost pointing guns at each other's heads, and that we needed to fix that. And we applied a lot of the learning that we had made throughout our open source journey inward. And we realized that if we can collaborate with our competitors, if the Visual Studio Team Services team can collaborate with GitHub, if the .NET team can collaborate with Google, then surely the Windows team and the Office team can get along with each other. And so Satya made basically a decree. And he said that Microsoft was going to go down the road of building one engineering system. And of course, it's Microsoft, so we've got a 3-letter acronym for it. It's 1ES. With one engineering system, we were going to adopt the best-of-breed technologies for everything. We were going to move everybody into Git. We were going to move everybody into Visual Studio Team Services, our cloud-hosted code repository. And we were going to open it up. So the idea now is that we were going to adopt an inner source workflow within Microsoft. We would open up all of the repositories throughout the company to each other. We would put the Windows code base into Git, which is an amazing story in and of itself. We had to build a technology called GVFS to do it, because Git alone, like I mentioned, can't handle giant repositories like the Windows code base. The Windows code base is 300 gigabytes. I don't know if it needs to be 300 gigabytes, but that's what happens over 20 years of accumulated technology growth. So we went down this path of building an inner source mechanism. So we put code bases like Windows. We're putting Office in now. All 4,000 developers on the Windows code base are checking into a Git repository all the time. And they're accepting pull requests. So all of the repositories within the company are now being hosted openly. It didn't used to be that I could see the Windows code base. Now I can. And there are actual tangible benefits from us doing this. This isn't just a nice thing to say that, you know, we can do this. Let me give you an example. So Visual Studio Team Services has code hosting. It also has a continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow. And a lot of the teams within Microsoft, of course, use that. Like I said, we eat our own dog food. One of the teams using that is Office. We moved Office into this inner source, one engineering system. And so they built out their continuous integration pipeline. And they were pretty pleased with it until it was time to move their apps over. Because you can get the iOS apps and the Android apps for Office. And so they started building their CI pipeline for the apps. And they got to the end, the very end. They built the apps, and then what they wanted to do was code sign those apps. Because, of course, to get into an app store, you need to be code signed. And so they came to us and said, hey, guys, how do I code sign this? And we said, you can't. It turns out that we had no mechanism for doing code signing at the end of a build. And they said, great, well, when do you get to that? And we're like, yeah, we're not. Like, this totally isn't on our radar. We got a bunch of other things to get done first. I know it's important for you. And they said, huh. And just like if they were using an open source project, they decided, well, we're all programmers here. I can add this. So they did what they would have done if this was an open source project. They forked the Visual Studio Team Services repo. And they went and added code signing support so that they could code sign their Android app and get it into the Google Play Store, code sign their iOS app, get it into the iOS store, the Apple Store. And then they opened a pull request and sent it back to us. And of course, we went back and forth a little bit. You know, we wanted a little touch up here, we wanted a little touch up there, a few changes, a couple of tweaks. And then we merged it. And then we deployed it. We deploy Visual Studio Team Services every 3 weeks. So a couple weeks later, now that was live in VSTS. And not just for the Office team, for all of our customers. So the Office team actually improved all of our customers' lives through this inner source workflow. And that's just one example. We've been seeing these positive benefits throughout the company. We've been seeing increased code velocity since we moved to Git, because it's so easy to create a branch in Git, as you all know, and just get busy, create a pull request. We've been seeing an increase in velocity to bring our code to market. It's so much easier to deploy now when we're all using very similar systems. We don't have to build out our own deployment mechanisms. The deployment pipelines that are there are excellent for us, right? So we can, as little parts of the organization, we can stop trying to reinvent the wheel. And that's so important for us, to just use best-of-breed technologies. So we were so happy to go down this path that we never thought we would go down at Microsoft, where we started just by realizing that we couldn't build our own tools for everything, that sometimes we needed to take off-the-shelf components, and sometimes those are open source. So we learned how to embrace the open source communities, how to work with them, even when there are competitors, like right here at GitHub and with Google. We learned then how to open source our own technologies and build communities around them so that people wanted to collaborate and make our products better. And finally, we looked at ourselves in the mirror and realized that these things that we were espousing publicly, we needed to do privately too. And so we needed to bring those into an inner source sort of workflow. So we're extremely happy. This is just the beginning of our journey, and we hope to continue and do excellent work in the open source world. So thanks so much for coming out. My name is Edward Thomson. I am just one of the open source engineers working on open source technologies at Microsoft. There's a lot of us. So thanks so much. And if you were interested in the story of how Microsoft adopted Git, be sure to check out a new podcast. It's called All Things Git. We're talking to people who are doing awesome things with Git and GitHub in their organizations. So thanks again.